Sometimes the smallest miracle begins with a child who simply refuses one more spoonful. My name is Claire Bennett, and the first thing I noticed when I walked into the Hayes estate was not its breathtaking beauty but its overwhelming silence. Morning sunlight poured through towering windows onto polished marble floors, reflecting across crystal chandeliers and priceless paintings that decorated every hallway. Every room looked perfect, yet none of them felt alive. Fresh flowers stood untouched in elegant vases. Expensive toys filled an enormous nursery. A tiny white high chair waited beside a polished dining table, perfectly clean, as though it had not been used in days. I had accepted the position as a maid expecting long hours and quiet responsibilities, but I quickly realized the greatest challenge inside that mansion had nothing to do with cleaning. It was hidden behind the soft blue eyes of a 2-year-old little boy named Oliver Hayes. Before I even unpacked my suitcase, the house manager quietly explained the situation. Oliver had refused nearly every proper meal for weeks. Doctors had examined him. Nutrition specialists had offered advice. Child care experts had visited the estate. Every suggestion ended the same way. The little boy simply turned his head away from every spoon placed before him. When I finally met Alexander Hayes, he stood beside the nursery window wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, looking over the gardens with the calm expression of a man who had mastered every challenge except the one that mattered most. He greeted me politely and thanked me for accepting the position. His voice remained steady, but exhaustion rested behind every word. He did not ask me to solve the problem. He simply asked me to be patient with his son. A few minutes later I stepped quietly into the nursery. Oliver sat on a soft rug surrounded by colorful wooden blocks and picture books. A warm bowl of oatmeal rested untouched on the small table beside him. He never looked at the food. Instead, he stared out the window toward a single bird resting on a nearby tree branch. I knelt several feet away without speaking. I did not offer him a spoon. I did not ask him to eat. I simply picked up one wooden block and slowly stacked it on another. After a long silence, Oliver reached for a second block and carefully placed it beside mine. We built a tiny tower together without exchanging a single word. When it finally toppled over, he looked at me for the first time. It was only a brief glance, but hidden inside those quiet blue eyes was something far more important than hunger. It was trust waiting for someone gentle enough to notice, and in that silent moment I realized I would never help him by asking him to eat first. I would have to help him feel safe enough to smile again. The next morning arrived with gentle rain tapping softly against the nursery windows, wrapping the entire estate in a peaceful silence that somehow felt less lonely than before. I prepared Oliver's breakfast exactly as the chef always had, a warm bowl of oatmeal topped with fresh blueberries and thin slices of banana, yet I placed it on the small table without inviting him to eat. Instead, I spread several colorful picture books across the rug and quietly sat beside them. Oliver watched me from across the room with cautious curiosity. After a few moments, he walked over carrying a tiny stuffed rabbit that had clearly been loved for a very long time. Without saying a word, he placed the rabbit beside my book before sitting down a comfortable distance away. I smiled but continued reading aloud, changing my voice for every animal in the story until a tiny laugh escaped from him before he quickly covered his mouth as though laughter had become something unfamiliar. That single sound filled the nursery with more warmth than the expensive fireplace ever could. We spent the rest of the morning building little paper birds, stacking wooden blocks, and watching raindrops race down the windows. I never mentioned breakfast. I never reached for the spoon. By lunchtime, another untouched meal rested nearby, but Oliver no longer seemed afraid whenever food appeared. He simply ignored it while staying close enough to keep playing. Late that afternoon, Alexander quietly paused outside the nursery door. He did not interrupt us. He watched his son smiling as a paper bird glided across the room before landing gently on the carpet. I could see surprise soften the tired expression on his face. I have not heard him laugh like that in months, he said after Oliver wandered toward the bookshelf. I answered honestly. Right now he does not need someone to convince him to eat. He needs someone to remind him that he is safe. Alexander remained silent for several seconds before nodding slowly. There was gratitude in his eyes, but there was also hope, fragile and unfamiliar, as though he had almost forgotten what hope looked like. That evening, just before bedtime, Oliver carefully picked up one of the paper birds we had folded together. He carried it to the little dining table, placed it beside his untouched bowl, and then looked back at me with a quiet smile. It was not a meal shared, but it was the first time he had willingly walked toward the table on his own, and somehow all three of us understood that the smallest steps often begin the greatest journeys. 3 peaceful mornings passed before anything truly changed, and I learned that progress rarely arrived with loud celebrations. It arrived quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments that most people would never notice. Every breakfast followed the same gentle routine. I placed a small bowl of warm oatmeal on Oliver's little table, then sat on the nursery rug with picture books, wooden animals, and colorful paper birds we folded together the day before. I never asked him to eat. I simply invited him to play. The nursery slowly transformed from a room filled with silence into a place where tiny giggles floated through the morning sunlight. Alexander often paused outside the open doorway before leaving for work. He never interrupted us. He simply watched his son smile with an expression that mixed hope and disbelief. One afternoon, while organizing a cabinet in the family library, I discovered a small keepsake box that contained photographs, greeting cards, and a voice recorder labeled with a simple handwritten note. The house manager quietly explained that it contained bedtime songs recorded by Oliver's late mother. I asked permission before listening. Her voice was gentle, calm, and filled with warmth. One melody repeated several times, almost like a lullaby whispered between heartbeats. Later that evening, as golden sunlight filled the nursery, I quietly hummed the same melody while building another tower of wooden blocks beside Oliver. At first he simply listened. Then he looked toward the little dining table where dinner waited untouched. Without anyone encouraging him, he slowly stood up, walked across the room, and rested one tiny hand on the back of his high chair. Alexander happened to arrive home at that exact moment. He remained perfectly still in the hallway, afraid that even one step might interrupt whatever was unfolding. I continued humming softly while smiling at Oliver without saying a single word about food. He climbed into the chair by himself and looked at the small silver spoon resting beside his bowl. His tiny fingers wrapped carefully around the handle. The room became so quiet that I could hear the clock in the hallway. Oliver lifted the spoon, dipped it into the oatmeal, and tasted one small bite. He paused for a second, then reached for another. Tears quietly filled Alexander's eyes as he watched from the doorway. He covered his mouth, unable to speak. I looked toward him for only a moment before returning my attention to Oliver, because this beautiful victory belonged to a little boy discovering safety again rather than to the adults surrounding him. As the evening sunlight faded beyond the nursery windows, Alexander whispered the words that had been waiting inside his heart for far too long. "Welcome back, my little boy." None of us realized that the first gentle spoonful had also become the first step toward healing an entire family. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm that slowly transformed every corner of the Hayes estate. Breakfast no longer felt like a battle waiting to happen. Instead, it became a peaceful gathering where patience replaced pressure and smiles appeared more often than silence. Every morning I prepared Oliver's favorite oatmeal with fresh blueberries and a drizzle of warm honey, placing the small silver spoon beside his bowl before sitting down across from him with another picture book. Sometimes he ate only a few careful spoonfuls. Other mornings he surprised us by finishing nearly half the bowl while listening to the gentle lullaby that had once filled his nursery. No one applauded. No one celebrated too loudly. We simply protected each small victory by allowing it to remain natural. Alexander gradually changed as well. He began leaving for work a little later so he could join breakfast, and every evening he returned home early enough to share dinner with Oliver instead of answering endless business calls. The mansion that had once echoed with silence slowly filled with ordinary conversations, soft laughter, and the comforting sounds of family life. One Saturday afternoon, sunlight poured across the kitchen while Oliver stood on a small wooden step stool wearing a tiny apron almost as large as he was. Together we stirred pancake batter, counted blueberries, and laughed each time a little flour floated into the air. Alexander walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of documents before stopping in complete surprise. He quietly placed the papers aside and watched his son carefully pour batter onto the warm griddle with my help. "May I help too?" he asked with a smile that reached his eyes. Oliver nodded eagerly before handing his father a wooden spatula. The three of us spent the next hour making uneven pancakes shaped like stars, bears, and little hearts. Some were far from perfect, yet every one of them disappeared from the plates with cheerful laughter. After breakfast, Oliver carefully picked up the small silver spoon that had become part of our daily routine. Instead of placing it back beside his bowl, he carried it across the room and gently pressed it into Alexander's hand. "Daddy," he whispered softly, "you eat with us now." Alexander knelt until he was eye level with his son, holding the little spoon as though it were the most valuable gift he had ever received. His voice trembled ever so slightly as he answered, "I promise I will." Watching the two of them together, I realized that healing had never been about convincing a child to eat. It had always been about helping a father and son find one another again, and deep inside I sensed that this beautiful beginning was preparing all three of us for an even greater chapter that none of us could yet imagine. Autumn arrived gently, bringing cool mornings and golden light that spilled across the breakfast room each day. The small silver spoon remained in its usual place beside Oliver's bowl, no longer a reminder of worry but a quiet symbol of hope. Every meal became another opportunity to celebrate ordinary moments that had once seemed impossible. Sometimes Oliver asked for another spoonful before I even offered one. Other times he wanted to feed himself while proudly announcing that he was becoming a big boy. Alexander never hurried those moments. He set his phone aside, ignored unnecessary meetings whenever he could, and chose to remain at the table until the last blueberry disappeared from Oliver's bowl. I noticed that the mansion itself seemed different. The nursery windows stayed open to welcome the fresh morning breeze. Soft music drifted through the hallways instead of silence. Fresh flowers appeared in every room because Oliver loved helping me arrange them in simple glass vases. One afternoon we gathered in the library to read picture books while rain gently tapped against the tall windows. Oliver climbed into Alexander's lap holding his favorite storybook and quietly rested his head against his father's shoulder. Alexander looked at me over the top of the pages with a grateful smile that needed no words. Later that evening he invited me to walk through the gardens before sunset. The roses were beginning to fade for the season, but the maple trees glowed with brilliant shades of amber and crimson. We walked slowly along the stone path without speaking for several minutes. Finally Alexander stopped beside a wooden bench overlooking the fountain. "I spent months trying to solve Oliver's problem," he said softly. "I searched for experts, answers, and perfect solutions. I never realized that what he needed most was someone willing to slow down and truly see him." I looked toward the fountain where gentle ripples reflected the fading sunlight. "Children often tell us exactly what they need," I replied. "They simply speak. With trust instead of words." Alexander nodded thoughtfully before taking a slow breath. "You have changed this house in ways I cannot measure. Every room feels alive again." I smiled quietly because I knew the change had never come from one person alone. It had grown from countless small moments shared together with patience and kindness. When we returned inside, Oliver ran toward us carrying the little silver spoon in one hand and his stuffed bear in the other. He reached for both of our hands at the same time, laughing as he pulled us toward the dining room. In that simple gesture I realized the distance between the three of us had almost disappeared, and although none of us spoke about the future that evening, it quietly felt as though our hearts had already begun walking there together. The first snowfall arrived quietly a few weeks later, covering the gardens with a blanket of white that made the entire estate feel softer and brighter than ever before. Inside the mansion, the warmth no longer came from the fireplaces alone. It came from the conversations that filled every room and from the laughter that echoed through hallways once defined by silence. Oliver now hurried into the dining room every morning carrying his favorite little silver spoon, proudly climbing into his chair before anyone called him. Breakfast had become his favorite part of the day because it meant all three of us would begin the morning together. Alexander rearranged his schedule so completely that his assistants often joked he had become impossible to book before 9 o'clock. He only smiled because there was nowhere else he would rather be than sitting beside his son while watching him finish another healthy meal. One Friday evening, Alexander invited every employee of the estate to a simple dinner in the grand hall. Long wooden tables replaced the formal arrangements usually prepared for important guests. Fresh flowers decorated the room, candles reflected softly across polished glass, and homemade desserts prepared by the kitchen staff waited beside warm apple pie. Everyone expected a holiday celebration, but Alexander slowly stood after dinner carrying nothing except a glass of sparkling cider. The room became completely silent. He looked around at every member of the staff before his eyes finally rested on me. There was a time when I believed success meant protecting my family by providing everything money could buy, he said calmly. Then someone reminded me that love cannot be purchased. It must be given patiently every single day. His voice remained steady, yet every word carried quiet sincerity. Claire did not simply help my son enjoy his meals again. She gave him back his smile. She gave this house back its heartbeat. She reminded me that the strongest people are often the kindest. I felt my face grow warm as every employee turned toward me with gentle smiles. Before I could say anything, Oliver climbed down from his chair carrying the little silver spoon that had become so precious to him. He walked confidently across the room and placed it into my hand. "This is for you," he said proudly. "It is my lucky spoon because you made breakfast happy." Tears blurred my vision as I knelt to thank him with a gentle hug. Alexander watched the moment in complete silence before quietly adding one final sentence that settled into every heart in the room. "Some people enter a house to work," he said softly. "Others enter a house and quietly become part of its soul." As the snow continued falling beyond the tall windows, I realized that none of us were simply sharing the same home anymore. Without noticing exactly when it happened, we had already begun living as a family. Winter slowly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring, and with every brighter morning the Hayes estate seemed to breathe a little easier. Fresh blossoms appeared beneath the old maple trees, birds returned to the gardens, and the breakfast table remained the happiest place in the house. Oliver now climbed into his chair without hesitation, carefully holding the little silver spoon before proudly asking for oatmeal, fruit, and warm pancakes. Watching him enjoy every meal no longer felt like witnessing a miracle. It had become something even more precious. It had become ordinary, and that was exactly what every loving family hopes for. One quiet afternoon, while Oliver napped peacefully upstairs, Alexander invited me to walk through the gardens that surrounded the estate. The air carried the sweet fragrance of blooming flowers, and sunlight danced across the fountain where gentle ripples reflected the clear blue sky. We wandered without speaking until we reached a small wooden bench hidden beneath an old flowering tree. Alexander remained standing for a long moment before quietly breaking the silence. "After my wife passed away, I believed my only responsibility was to protect Oliver from every possible hardship," he admitted softly. "I surrounded him with the best doctors, the finest teachers, and everything money could provide. I never realized that what he truly needed was the feeling that someone was simply present beside him." His voice carried no pride, only honesty. I listened without interrupting because some truths need room to breathe before they can heal. After several moments, I gently replied, "Children do not ask us to erase their sadness. They ask us to stay beside them until they feel strong enough to smile again." Alexander looked toward the gardens where Oliver had begun laughing only weeks earlier. A peaceful smile slowly appeared across his face. "You never tried to replace the memories we lost," he said quietly. "You helped us carry them without fear." Before I could answer, small footsteps hurried across the stone path behind us. Oliver ran through the blooming garden holding his stuffed rabbit in one hand and the little silver spoon in the other. He climbed onto the bench between us with complete confidence before taking my hand first and then reaching for his father's. Looking up at both of us with bright blue eyes, he asked the simplest question I had ever heard. "Can we always have breakfast together?" Alexander and I looked at one another before smiling at the little boy sitting between us. "Yes," we answered together without hesitation. Oliver leaned comfortably against both of us, completely certain of the answer before he had even asked. As warm spring sunlight settled across the garden, I realized that families are not created by extraordinary promises. They are quietly built through countless ordinary mornings shared around the same table, one gentle spoonful and one faithful heart at a time. Summer returned with long golden evenings that stretched across the gardens, and the Hayes estate welcomed a season unlike any it had known before. Every room carried signs of everyday happiness. Fresh flowers decorated the windowsills because Oliver insisted on picking them himself each morning. Children's drawings covered one wall of the breakfast room, each picture filled with smiling faces, bright sunshine, and a tiny silver spoon that always appeared somewhere in the corner. It had quietly become his favorite symbol because, to him, it represented the day everything began to change. One Saturday afternoon Alexander invited a few close friends and the entire household staff to the garden for a simple family gathering. There were no grand speeches or formal decorations. White tablecloths covered long wooden tables beneath the old maple trees. Fresh lemonade sparkled in tall glasses. Homemade pies cooled beside baskets of warm bread, and children from neighboring families laughed together across the wide green lawn. As the sun slowly descended, Oliver ran toward me carrying the little silver spoon wrapped carefully inside a blue ribbon. He smiled with the same bright confidence that had once seemed impossible. "Daddy helped me keep this safe," he whispered. "Today it has another job." Before I could ask what he meant, Alexander stepped forward wearing a navy suit instead of his usual black one. His expression remained calm, yet warmth filled every glance he directed toward me. He gently accepted the ribbon from Oliver before reaching into his jacket pocket and removing a small velvet box. The conversations around us faded into complete silence. "When you first arrived here," he said softly, "I believed I was hiring someone to care for my son. I never imagined you would teach both of us how to live again." His eyes never left mine. "You never asked for recognition. You never expected anything in return. You simply chose kindness every single day until this house became a home again." He carefully tied the blue ribbon around the velvet box before placing it into my hands. "I would like every new beginning in my life to start beside you. Claire, will you marry me?" Tears filled my eyes before I could answer, not because of the beautiful ring waiting inside the box, but because of the little boy already hugging both of our legs with complete certainty. I knelt beside Oliver first, kissed the top of his head, then looked back at Alexander with a smile that carried every emotion words could never fully express. "Yes," I whispered. "With all my heart." The garden erupted with joyful applause as warm evening light settled across the trees. Oliver lifted the little silver spoon high into the air like the greatest treasure in the world, and at that beautiful moment I understood that the strongest promises are often built from the smallest acts of love remembered forever. 1 year passed with quiet grace, and the Hayes estate no longer resembled the lonely mansion I had entered on my very first morning. Every sunrise now carried familiar sounds that made the house feel wonderfully alive. Oliver's cheerful footsteps echoed through the hallway before breakfast. Alexander's laughter often followed as they raced toward the kitchen together, pretending that whoever reached the table first earned the right to choose the fruit for the day. The little silver spoon still rested beside Oliver's bowl every morning, carefully polished and treasured, not because he still needed encouragement to eat but because it reminded all of us that hope can begin with the smallest gesture. Our wedding had filled the estate with joy, yet the happiest moments came afterward in the ordinary rhythm of family life. We planted flowers together each spring, baked blueberry muffins on rainy afternoons, and ended every evening reading stories beneath the soft glow of the nursery lamp. Alexander gradually transformed his business schedule so that breakfast and dinner became appointments he never allowed himself to miss. He often said those 2 meals had become the most important meetings of his entire day. Inspired by everything our family had experienced, we quietly created a community program for parents raising young children through difficult seasons of grief and emotional change. Every Saturday morning families gathered in the gardens behind the estate, where children painted colorful pictures, folded paper birds, shared healthy meals, and laughed beneath the old maple trees. Parents who had once arrived carrying heavy hearts slowly discovered comfort simply by watching their children smile again. Oliver proudly welcomed every new family with the same kindness that had once been shown to him. Whenever a frightened child hesitated to join the games, he gently offered them his favorite wooden bird and said, "You can play beside me." One warm autumn evening, after another joyful gathering had ended, the 3 of us sat together on the garden bench watching the sunset color the sky with shades of gold and amber. Oliver carefully placed the little silver spoon between Alexander and me before slipping both of his tiny hands into ours. "This spoon helped me find my family," he said with complete sincerity. Alexander smiled through grateful eyes before quietly answering, "No, my son. Love did that." The spoon simply reminded us to keep believing. I looked at the peaceful home surrounding us, the laughter still drifting across the gardens, and realized that miracles rarely arrive as grand unforgettable moments. More often they grow patiently inside ordinary mornings, shared meals, gentle words, and faithful hearts that choose one another every single day. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the trees, I understood that the greatest gift we had ever received was never the beautiful estate or the comfortable life around us. It was the privilege of sitting together at one table, grateful for another ordinary breakfast waiting to greet us with tomorrow's sunrise.